because the government can influence inflation through its own spending, through cutting wasteful spending, through prudent fiscal management. The government can control inflation. But the OECD Economic Outlook forecast has predicted that inflation will be higher for longer under Labor.
The question is that grievances be noted, and I call the member for Hughes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak about the Albanese government's failure to deliver for Australians, its failure to deliver for my electorate of Hughes. I say that now, Deputy Speaker, as we are 18 months into this government's first term. It is now an appropriate time for us to consider what the government has achieved based on the election promises it made. And I'll start with Anthony Albanese when he was opposition leader. On the 17th of March 2022, he said a Labor government will lower the cost of living. Lower the cost of living. That was a promise. It was made 8 weeks out from the election. It was a core election commitment. And at the Labor campaign launch, he spoke about cheaper mortgages, cheaper electricity, about making housing more affordable, about increasing real wages. Well, let's look at how some of that has turned out. Let's particularly look at cheaper mortgages. In my electorate of Hughes, Deputy Speaker, home ownership is very important. Close to 70% of my electorate own their own home, either outright or about half that number are mortgage holders. These mortgage holders have now endured 12 interest rate rises under this government, under the leadership of a Prime Minister who promised cheaper mortgages. An Australian family with a mortgage of $750,000, and many in my electorate, Deputy Speaker, have mortgages far higher than that. That average family is now paying $24,000 more per year than it did under the former coalition government. Now, the government's made all sorts of excuses about interest rates and particularly espouses the independence of the Reserve Bank in setting interest rates. That is correct. The Reserve Bank does have that independence. The Reserve Bank should have that independence. But the Reserve Bank's underlying concern is about inflation, and this is something that the government, under the leadership of the Prime Minister, can influence. Just yesterday, RBA Acting Assistant Governor Marion Kohler said domestically sourced inflation, services price inflation, has been widespread and slow to decline. And then, underlying inflation is higher than expected a year ago. The Reserve Bank has only one very blunt instrument to deal with inflation, that is interest rates. This means that Australians with mortgages have had to carry the responsibility for the government's failure to rein in inflation. Because the government can influence inflation through its own spending, through cutting wasteful spending, through prudent fiscal management, the government can control inflation. But the OECD Economic Outlook forecast has predicted that inflation will be higher for longer under Labor. Turning to another one of the Prime Minister's election campaign promises, that of cheaper energy. The Prime Minister said on 97 separate occasions that a Labor government would bring down power bills by $275. Since being elected Deputy Speaker, I've conducted many mobile offices throughout my electorate. I have door-knocked. I am yet to find anyone in the electorate of Hughes who is now paying $275 less than in May 2022. And if we look at some of the figures, in March 2022, an average annual power bill was $1,393. Now, in November 2023, it is $1,827, nowhere near a $275 reduction. I mention energy costs not only because of the Prime Minister's broken promise on this, but because Minister Bowen has gotten the entire energy policy wrong. The government has rightly committed to net zeros. This is supported. But the minister will not consider a hybrid mix of baseload power. He therefore cannot assure my electorate or the rest of the country that he has the right policy to ensure affordable renewable energy into the future, reliable energy into the future. Independent reports are now providing that his transmission line rollout is well behind schedule and that independent review has forecast a blowout of beyond the amount forecast of $1 trillion. Communities along our eastern seaboard, from the Illawarra to the far north coast, are questioning the environmental basis of offshore wind projects, and regional communities are concerned about impacts on agricultural land. But Minister Bowen, when asked question after question about looking beyond renewable energy only, has refused to answer the questions or sticks to his renewable energy zealotry. It cannot be that we can transition to net zeros relying only on renewable energies. No other country in the world has managed this. Many countries in Europe, though, have embraced modern nuclear as a net zero technology. Deputy Speaker, even the Greens in Finland have now endorsed it. In my electorate, with the only nuclear reactor in the country, my constituents understand the importance of nuclear science. Many of them are employed at ANSTO at Lucas Heights. With the AUKUS arrangement and future nuclear-powered submarines, Australia will significantly increase its nuclear expertise in the years to come. It is therefore inexplicable to me and inexplicable to my electorate as to why Minister Bowen refuses to consider any other options to address our future energy supply. Housing policy remains another spectacular failure of this government. During the election campaign and in the 18 months of this government, my constituents constantly raise housing affordability. This was a priority concern during the election and remains one today. Those under the age of 40 are concerned that they will never be able to afford a home within my electorate. Their parents and grandparents who have grown up there are similarly concerned. Minister Collins finally had to succumb to the Greens in order to have a Housing Australia Future Fund bill passed. We heard nonsense from the Greens at the time about rent controls, which demonstrated their collective failure to understand one of the underlying tenets of Australia's strong history and of economic growth and prosperity, that of private home ownership, the great Australian dream. Australia's rate of home ownership has been declining since the baby boomer generation brought their homes. At the moment, home ownership amongst Australians under the age of 40 is at its lowest rate since 1947. Being able to afford a home is becoming harder and harder for younger Australians, not only in my electorate but throughout our entire country. Therefore, the government's failure, the government leaving private home ownership out of its housing policy, means the Labor government has failed to understand the way the housing sector in this country works. Halfway through its term, the government has failed to deliver policies and legislation that will assist Australians, particularly younger Australians, into private home ownership. This is an intergenerational equity, but significantly it shows the government's failure to understand the importance of how our country has been built on the back of private home ownership. In my electorate, with median home prices around $1.5, $1.6 million, first home buyers now need more than $300,000, closer to $400,000, as well as an income level of beyond $250,000 to service that loan. That is simply unaffordable. To great fanfare, the minister declared that there was a housing fund that would deliver $10 billion for housing. It was not that. Instead, the minister could and should have incentivised state and local governments to increase urban densities in appropriate locations, those areas well serviced by transport infrastructure. Now we come to infrastructure, Deputy Speaker. Heathcote Road within my electorate is 24 kilometres in length. It joins the western end of my electorate in Moorebank to the eastern end at Heathcote. More than 30,000 car journeys per day on this road. It joins Western Sydney to the Illawarra to the south coast. Most of it is one lane each way. Former state and federal coalition governments commenced duplication programs. At the last election, I committed to studies to investigate the full duplication of Heathcote Road for the safety and convenience of long-suffering commuters. This project now appears to have been abandoned by Minister King. This is an infrastructure investment that could have increased productivity as those involved in the trades in the construction industry utilise this road every day. The Prime Minister during the election said that Labor will put the focus back on nation-building infrastructure, and he said, "I will use the Infrastructure Australia model I created as minister." Well, where is that model? Minister King announced a 90-day review of infrastructure projects committed to by the previous government. We are now at more than 200 days of that review, and it appears an important project for my electorate will be scrapped. Productivity. On productivity growth, the Prime Minister said we were going to embark on a new era of economic reform with product productivity growth at its centre. Unfortunately, productivity is in freefall. It's now fallen 3 consecutive quarters, the first time this has occurred since 2005. Therefore, Deputy Speaker, on cost of living, housing, infrastructure, inflation, productivity, energy prices, these are key markers of the government's failure halfway through its first term to have addressed those issues important to Australians, important to my electorate in Hughes.
Thank you. The question is that grievances